Well, good evening, everybody. Welcome. Come in, make yourself at home, pull up a chair, pour yourself a beer. My name's Mark Littlewood. I'm the Director General here at the IEA, and welcome to this, the latest in our series of IEA in conversation webinars. And in these events, we sit down with a politician, a thought leader, a newsmaker to discuss their philosophy, views of the world, what they make about the world around us today, with all of its numerous problems. And so before I introduce our guest today, let me just tell you how things are going to work. We're actually streaming this event on two platforms. Some of you will be joining us on the Zoom side of the event. It's also being streamed live on YouTube for anybody to watch if they wish. Please feel free to share comments, make observations, share interesting links and all of the rest. For those of you on the Zoom side of the equation, perhaps I can make sure that you use the Q&A chat if you would like to put a question to our speaker, not the chat function. Use the chat function if you've got technical difficulties, you can't hear me, you want to complain about me, you want to complain about David, but if you actually want to put a question, put it in the Q&A section. And whether you want to put a question or not, all of you can upvote the questions that you want me to put to David. I'll be talking to him for about half an hour and then I'll take questions from you. For you guys on the YouTube side of the chat, we'll do our very best to pick up questions that you put in the YouTube chat there. They'll be cut and pasted over to me, and we'll do what we can to put your questions to our guest as well. So now that's out of the way, it's a great pleasure to welcome tonight's fantastic guest, a dear friend of the Institute of Economic Affairs and Freedom more generally, David Davis MP, the Right Honourable David Davis. He has been the Member of Parliament for Haltemprice and Howden, formerly Boothferry, I believe it was called, since 1987. He first joined the government in 1994 as Minister of State for Europe. In opposition, he variously served as the Conservatives' Shadow Home Secretary, Shadow Deputy Prime Minister and Chairman of the Conservative Party. He returned to government in 2016 where he served as Secretary of State for exiting the European Union and our chief Brexit negotiator. Prior to his time in politics, David worked for Tate Lyle for 17 years and served in the Special Forces in the Territorial Army's 21 SAS Regiment. Quite a CV. And I should just say, just 5 days ago, the Times released analysis that found David is the most rebellious Conservative MP of this Parliament, having voted against his party whip 25 times since the general election. What a career. David, lovely to have you with us. Thanks so much for joining us.
Pleasure to be here. I'm ashamed it's only 25.
Well, maybe tick it up. We're gonna find out about that shortly. David, I want to start talking to you about civil liberties. Fighting for civil liberties has been a huge part of your political career. In fact, going back to 2008, of course, you famously triggered a by-election focused entirely on the erosion of civil liberties in the UK. These have been bleak days, haven't they, for anyone who holds civil liberties remotely dear? I mean, what a year. It's catastrophic, isn't it?
It's pretty awful. And truth be told, we saw it coming. I mean, when the government moved its act of Parliament, the sort of coronavirus emergency act, it was plain what it was doing was not just giving itself powers, it's giving itself unfettered powers. So it didn't actually have to come back to Parliament to ask for approval for anything. You know, it was worse in that way than the Civil Contingencies Act that Tony Blair took a whole year to get through the House. So, and we did that in 1 day. So yeah, I mean, it's been pretty grim from the point of view of a civil libertarian. The counter argument, I guess, is that whereas when we're talking about civil liberties vis-a-vis terrorism, which was the big Tony Blair excuse, there you were talking, hopefully, about dozens or maybe hundreds of lives at risk. Here, of course, you're talking about tens, in fact, hundreds of thousands now. So you can see a sort of nominal moral justification, but the truth is we've given away an awful lot in the last year.
We sure have. And what's been your take on this, the unfolding nature of lockdowns and liberties we've surrendered? We at the IEA have, as usual, a panoply of discordant views on which incursions into our liberties are justified, if any. But are you sympathetic to at least some of the measures the government has taken? And I'm talking in principled terms here. We can always argue about whether they should have been done earlier or later or policed better. But what sort of, if we'd had a Davis government rather than a Johnson government, what sort of restrictions was you as Prime Minister have imposed and when? And how different would they have been from what we've actually experienced since March last year?
I would have been tougher on the justification. I mean, you often see Chris Whitty and other advisors, the chief scientific and medical advisor of the government, saying, "Oh, we need to have this lockdown. We need to have an emergency, a circuit breaker, or an emergency break. These sorts of things." And the level of justification they use for that is almost zero. If they were going to introduce a drug to deal with the pandemic, that drug would have to pass safety consideration, have to be demonstrated that it works, all those sorts of things. You know, we know how many drugs have gone by the wayside, hydroxychloroquine, all these sorts of things, quite properly been put to one side because they haven't been shown to work. I haven't seen any hard analysis of the lockdown measures at all. Frankly, not anywhere in the world, or at least those that have been done have been inconclusive. Some of them have even had opposite outcomes. You know, shutting schools. You know, you see studies that say it works and studies that say it doesn't work. So we're basically going on, you know, sort of almost what I tend to think of as saloon bar politics. You know, what you need to do is this sort of thing. You know, it's being seen to be done as much as being effective, and that's the biggest problem for me. This so-called working on the science. Very often, there's very little science behind it.
David, the first civil liberty of yours I'm going to intrude on is to ask you to speak just a little louder. Some of our guests have said you're not coming through particularly, so if I can ask you to lean in and you'll have no trouble shouting at me. That happens a lot when we talk to each other. So feel free to absolutely shout at me. So I agree with you about the way that the policy process has gone. But here is the real problem, and I guess why we've had so many internal debates at the IEA, that this is exactly the sort of situation in which even libertarian-leaning people agree that the government's going to have to take some action, that people's actions are potentially not self-regarding or other-regarding. And then you start to get into a very sort of murky discussion about how much faith do you place in this, what level of proof is needed for that. I mean, do you think the lockdowns have really worked at all? I mean, they presumably stop human interaction, or don't stop it, but limit human interaction. Is that a reasonable way to go? What would be the criteria at which they should be released? That's what I'm most worried about, is that there's no end goal at which we sort of say, if deaths fall to X or if hospitalizations fall to Y, we'll open up again. How would you have approached those sort of conundrums?
They work a bit. The best evidence of the fact that they work is look what's happened to the level of influenza. It's dropped away. I mean, the lockdowns, the social distancing measures have all worked. What, however, you've got to recognize as well is that what stopped the disease at the end of the first wave, if you like, wasn't the lockdowns, it was the summer. You know, this is an incredibly seasonal disease. You can, and that's why I think we shouldn't have been surprised when the second round came. But for me, the most important thing now is that when we lift this lockdown, it is the last time. You know, if I were just to bring it to practical things, if I were running a cafe or a taxi firm, or a plumber's, or a small business of any sort, right? And the government said, right, we're going to lift the lockdown. Would I restart my company? Would I? Hell, at the moment, you know, because the costs are starting up and then stopping again and starting. I want to see an end to it. I want to see an end at two levels. I want to see an end in terms of no more lockdowns, and we're nearly at that point. I worry more about that than when we come out of it. Let's make sure once and for all it's over. And vaccination, plus loads of other treatments will allow us to do that. You know, dexamethasone and heaven knows vitamin D even, but a whole series of drugs will help us. The second thing really is that we get rid of this stuff off the statute books once we're gone. You know, I mean, the trouble with civil liberties as a general issue is that governments stick it on the statute book, for an emergency, and then it's still there 50 years later, and that's true of everything from income tax onwards.
Yes, no, that's exactly true. So it's not just, all right, you're not adamant about the precise date on which lockdown ends. Maybe that's the April, maybe it's May. That might be based on a kind of medical diagnosis. But when it does end, not only do you want it to be the final word on it, but are you, I know you would want this, are you confident that our civil liberties will return in full? i.e. that we'll be back to being able to do everything we could in February? Or is there a danger there's going to be an incremental easing and we will never actually get back everything? I don't know whether face masks will still be compulsory on public transport, to take a relatively trivial example. We've had this nonsense that the pubs might be able to reopen but not be allowed to serve alcohol. I'm not saying that would be a permanent state of affairs, but Hayek obviously warned that when states acquire powers to deal with a particular crisis, whether that's a pandemic or a war, they don't tend to hand them back even when that crisis has abated.
Yeah, well, Hayek lived through the Second World War, even in Britain, and that was exactly what happened. No, it's not a risk; it's a certainty. And indeed, some of the things that I resist, you may wonder why, but because they're ones I think will be very difficult to get back. For example, currently we're talking about a vaccination passport. Well, sort of over my dead body, really. Within. I'm not fussed about a vaccination passport to go somewhere, to go to France or to go to, or indeed to come here. But I am very fussed about the idea that your ability to go down the pub depends on you carrying a certificate in your pocket. One of the most distinctive things about this country, partly because we're an island, that's our institutional history of you don't have to say to a policeman, "Here are my papers," and so I will resist things like a vaccination passport, even though it may sound sensible on the face of it, because I don't think we'll ever get rid of the damn things once we have them.
Okay, and do you think that's where we're going to get to there? Can we look forward to, I don't want to press you on a date, but let's say by the 1st of September, let's hope it's a lot earlier than that everything will have snapped back? Or are you worried about this overhang? And more especially, are you worried that when something like this comes round again, perhaps in milder form, seasonal flu, for example, that a certain degree of lockdowns, I'm not suggesting the government would close down the whole economy, but it might say, well, we've got, in 2 years' time, we've got a pretty nasty bout of seasonal flu. Actually, I'm afraid, you're only allowed a table for 4 at a restaurant and you've all got to be sitting 3 meters apart. Do you think there's a danger, having got a taste for this, even when we cracked COVID-19, that any other illness, even something nothing like as bad in terms of fatalities, will justify a state intervention, having established that precedence this time?
That's a risk, not a certainty, for a couple of reasons. Number one, we will or should be able to do proper pandemic planning. The previous pandemic planning was a thing called Operation Cygnus some years ago, and they assumed 450,000 deaths. And so, what did they spend the exercise doing? Fretting about the number of body bags. They didn't do the work to prevent the 450,000 deaths, as it were. And so what we've got to do is to make sure the next time we have a pandemic, and there will be another one, and they will come more frequently, is that we have measures in place that don't impinge on our freedom. Now, the optimistic thing about this is that, generally speaking, when I am battling for civil liberties, it's very often, to say lonely, it's a single pursuit sometimes. Yet, you've now got a whole group of people, the coronavirus research group, so-called, whose primary interest is preserving our civil liberties. So this has created a reaction of its own of about, 30 or 40 Tory MPs who are now determined not to let those things happen. And that's a healthy outcome of this. Whether it'll be sufficiently strong, I don't know yet. But I think there are quite a lot of people around next time around will be less forgiving. Remember, the moment the government gets something like 70, 80% support for what it's doing, because the public know it's a problem nobody's seen before, they know people are going to make mistakes and so on, they won't be so forgiving. So I think for a couple of reasons, we've got cause to be optimistic.
Okay, well, that's encouraging. How do you think the government has handled the scrutiny side of this? Put aside whether you approve or disapprove of restriction X or restriction Y, I mean, again, our liberties are, repealed at haste and returned at leisure. Do you think that the executive has shown too draconian approach to saying, there's the whole package of measures, Parliament, you've got to do this, it's a national emergency? Do you think you and fellow parliamentarians should have been slicing and dicing this a bit more, getting rid of restriction 106, agreeing to restriction 107?
Yes, from the beginning. I mean, the difficulty was that Parliament itself was naive about this. I mean, when you talk about the executive, you're right to use that word. This is as much Whitehall as it is ministers, right? It's Whitehall's reflex to grab power. And when that original coronavirus emergency bill went through the House, I was saying, look, this is actually, there are very few new powers in this bill over and above it would be the 1984 Health Act and the Civil Contingencies Act. But the difference is that in the Civil Contingencies Act, if they did something, they'd have to come back within 7 days and get the House of Commons to approve it, or it died. That was the presumption. I remember that fighting that act through the House to get those. They took all of that out. And the Labour government just sat there and took it. Sorry, the Labour opposition sat there and took it. All they wanted was a so-called sunset clause, which always turned into rubber stamps, an unamendable sunset clause. So we were limp about that collectively as a parliament. I think we'd be a bit less naive next time. A few months ago, the government started to be forced to come back to the House. So it's slightly better than it was, but they started out, Whitehall and his widest, Sir Humphrey, started out the determination not to give Parliament a check or a balance on this, and they were successful most of the time.
There's been virtually nothing good. In fact, I can't think of anything good in any that's about COVID-19. I think some people say it might have brought about a sense of social solidarity. The only good thing it's had from a news point of view is it at least knocked Brexit off the front pages every day as being the only thing we ever discussed. It kind of put that into sharp relief. You, of course, were a prominent Brexiteer. It was sort of an agonizing 4 years of batting backwards and forwards. Of course, you were the Secretary of State for Brexit. You joined us at an IEA event to launch Plan A+, our document, which has been remarkably close to where the government has finally ended up. Is it mission accomplished? Are you happy with the outcome? We're out. Is it time for celebration? Is it a 9.5 out of 10, a 5 out of 10? What's your audit of Brexit to date?
I'd say it's about a 7 or 8 out of 10. I mean, to be fair to Boris, it's probably as good as he could have done, given the pass he got from the Theresa May government. What the Boris approach, accurately the David Frost approach, he was the prime negotiator, demonstrated, and this is a terrible "I told you so," so I'll try not to do it again. But it demonstrated that my argument at the beginning, that you've got to be tougher with them, you've got to lay down the rules of engagements, as it were, the sequencing, all that sort of stuff. You've got to stand up to them when they make unreasonable demands, was right, because when they did stand up to them, even threatening to break international law, which I thought was a slightly silly way to present it, but never mind, then the union backed off. And so we've got a reasonable outcome. What I suspect, however, is that we are going to be struggling with the details of it for some years. There'll be lots of backwards and forwards subsequent negotiations. But broadly speaking, it will be a success. It's a bit hard to disentangle the effects from COVID, of course. For example, take the cross-border movements, which is always the big worry. Well, how on earth do you work out what is to do with Brexit and what is to do with the fact that we've got tens of thousands of empty, unused containers blocking the ports because they haven't gone backwards to China and back to China or wherever. But broadly speaking, it's right. Broadly speaking, in terms of our national autonomy, it will deliver what we hoped it would.
Okay, let me just play devil's advocate for a second here. I was also, the IEA took no position, but I also personally voted for Brexit myself. But one of the things I'm enjoying most about it in some ways is that it doesn't seem to have made any difference. It sort of doesn't much matter on the face of it, whether you're a member of the European Union or not. You're right, okay, you know, there's a bit more paperwork at Dover. But compared to the do you think the importance of whether we stayed or left was, if you like, oversold by both sides? It seems to me, you might argue it's more than a rounding error, but is it really the most fundamental decision of a generation? I mean, very little has changed. And I sort of welcome that, because I think it slightly proves the emperor has no clothes as far as state institutions are concerned. It doesn't sort of make a huge difference to one's life. But we were told this was going to be epic one way or another.
Yeah, well, firstly, of course, I think to some extent the referendum was fought on grounds that weren't ever going to be the biggest issues, right? Whether it's a number on the side of a bus, or whether it's what it's going to do to our trading balance, they were never going to be the biggest. The big issue, to be frank, is going to be the fact that in the next 10, 20 years, the whole shape of international politics is going to change. America today, to just give you an example, America today is the biggest economy in the world, pretty much, and the biggest military power in the world. In 20 years' time, that will not be true. It will be China, right? Assuming something dramatic doesn't happen in the next decade, it will be China. And in fact, America will be sort of primus inter pares amongst the English-speaking world, the Western democracies. You pick which group you like. And in that circumstance, our freedom to act is going to be 100 times more important, because of our relationship with the Americans, the fact we speak English, and so on. Now, none of that's going to be visible today. None of it. You know, I mean, I doubt it's even visible to anybody outside a few professors in a few departments. So I agree with you. The immediate impact will not be enormous, and in fact will be indistinguishable from Brexit. And even on the economic front, the truth of the matter is, all this argument about regulation, you know what? I don't think the regulation for the chemical industry is going to change by more than a couple of commas. I don't think the regulation for the car industry is going to change by very much, for the simple reason that actually it starts with the United Nations, not with Europe, and gets handed down by Europe. But the regulations for artificial intelligence or genetics, or dare I say vaccines, to make the sort of the most stark change, will be big. Why? Because they're new burgeoning industries, and we are leaders in those industries, and we will want to have a much stronger say in that than we would have had if we just one of 27 in the European Union. And let's just finish on the vaccine point. You know, millions of people were vaccinated at least a month, maybe 2 months earlier than they would have been had we still been in. That's the simple truth. The EMA would have still been struggling through its approval process. Some people said, oh, we would have let you deviate. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they say that now, but they wouldn't have been saying that if we'd been inside. Can you imagine the fuss? You know, and that's the other thing. In as much as there are big impacts on individuals, they will be unpredictable. And if you'd asked me 2 years ago, you know, what's going to be the big immediate impact of Brexit, I wouldn't have said, oh, we'll all be vaccinated.
Yeah. But your sort of confidence, if you like, is based around not so much the stock of regulations, which you think will be largely unchanged, but the flow. So in the same, God knows how artificial intelligence or whatever will be regulated. Your hope, however, if I understand this correctly, is that a sovereign United Kingdom government has a better chance, will make a better fist of it than the European Union when it comes to decisions about, you know, subjects that we can only speculate on. God only knows what the big policy issues are, as you say, in 5 or 6 years' time. You see, I've been a bit disappointed that there hasn't been more of, I want to say an attack, that makes it sound more violent, but more forensic scrutiny of the stock. I mean, the whole argument for years was that the EU's regulatory system isn't optimal, it's not right for the UK. But other than reducing the taxation on women's sanitary products, I don't think we've done anything else, have we?
And but you and I might differ on which matters most, stock or flow, right? To an existing stable business, dominated by big business, the stock doesn't match the cost. It really doesn't. I mean, I used to work for Tate Lyle. We used to work cross borders, moving not just sugar, but lots of other things across borders. We had a department to deal with all the regulatory impacts. And our concern was they didn't change very much. Yeah? If they didn't change, it's easy. Work like a clockwork machine, almost literally like a clockwork machine, right? Stock matters most to new entrants, the small businesses, and in a business like the sort of industrial chemicals industry, there aren't many of them, right? But when you come to the businesses like artificial intelligence or genetics or whatever, both stock and flow matter. Both stock and flow matter, and that's where it's going to have the highest leverage. You won't measure this by a regulatory count, I guarantee you, because Europe's the second biggest enemy when it comes to the issue of regulations in the UK. Sir Humphrey is the first biggest enemy. He likes it. He has an endemic interest in it.
Yeah, no, exactly right. But then let's. Obviously, you've painted an optimistic picture over, say, a generation there that we might be better equipped to make less bad regulatory decisions in the future than the European Union might. I wonder if you could tell us a little there about your take on this present government's approach. It seems not unlike the Theresa May government, that it has a lot of sort of free market capitalist rhetoric, buccaneering Brexit, free trading over the waves, booming for business, nothing we can't achieve, but pretty thin on policy prescriptions that fit that mold. I mean, in fact, a very interventionist government obviously has spent a colossal amount of money over COVID, not necessarily going to criticize them for that. You can argue about it, but it's now sort of, well, which taxes might we have to put up? There doesn't seem to be any suggestion that there are taxes that should be dramatically lowered to help the recovery, or regulations that should be eased to help the recovery. Have we got a government that sort of talks libertarianism but practices social democracy?
Unfortunately, I mean, to copy Chou En-lai, it's too soon to say. He said about the French Revolution, and the trouble is that they've been basically paralysed for over a year. You've got a brand new government. I mean, when Boris appointed his government, I thought, they're a bit inexperienced. Quite a lot of them are inexperienced. I mean, they may be very clever people, but they're inexperienced, and it doesn't matter. A couple of years until we come to our first crisis, and then, of course, silly me, you can never say you've got a couple of years to your first crisis. As it was a couple of weeks to the first crisis, and they haven't had a chance really to get their feet under the table and establish a proper dynamic. And if you are going to deal with regulation, then I think it takes an institutional dynamic. Individual ministers, certainly individual MPs, can't do it. They've got to have that dynamic. They have a mechanism to do it. And the truth is, there are two ways of reducing the burden of regulation. One is to just scrap the regulation. This government's not going to do that, and neither are any future governments. I hate to disappoint you, Mark, but that's the fact of life. What you can do, however, is maybe try to get roughly the same outcome in safety terms with less burden, and that ought to be, well, it ought to be, it is possible. Why is it possible? Because the European Union is a terrible creator of regulations. It's ponderous, burdensome, hasn't historically, until we started to leave, viewed it as a competitive problem. It's only when we started to go away and they thought, oh my God, they're going to compete with us on regulation, that they started to fret about it. So we can do a better job on that, but it won't be a bonfire, the regulations. It'll never happen. No, I'm afraid it's not a question of intent or will. It's a question of courage. No government is brave enough to do that.
Okay, but then moving from the regulatory side of the economy, the red tape on business, let's just say it is what it is, and let's hope that we're better at the flow now we're outside of the EU. But what about the tax spend deficit position, the fiscal position of this government? And I say even red-blooded sort of free market liberals like me, I think, are willing to accept that governments are likely to spend quite a lot of money over the sort of course of the pandemic. but we are in quite a hole, which is made worse by our public finances having been in a pretty grim position for some considerable time. I think you need to go back to 2001 before any government ran a budget surplus. And then when you start to build in the liabilities, the demographics are against us. According to the Taxpayers Alliance, the tax burden this year is the highest for more than half a century. And if you were to take a sort of 5-year average rather than a snapshot, it's the highest for 70 years. Shows no sign of going down. The government will certainly amount to more than 50% of GDP this year. Are we now just sort of stuck on that as well, that governments are always going to spend 43%, 44% of GDP, slightly overspend in the good times and monumentally overspend in the bad times?
Well, that's the post-war habit, of course. Even under Thatcher, that was true. I think before COVID, it was about the second worst year for 50 years in terms of tax burden. That's about where we were. And frankly, there's not really very much excuse for that. However, I'm going to shock you, I suspect, because I am not a budget balancer in these next 2 years. I take the view this is like a war. We have had to spend vast amounts of money. I think probably we did have to spend them, otherwise the economy would have crashed. But it's like a war, and you have to treat the financing like a war. Nobody said in 1944 we better balance the books. We might be dealing with a rather more imminent problem if we were balancing the books in 43 or 44. So I think we're going to have to somehow sterilize the quite enormous quantity of debt that we have taken on this year, in the last 12 months, and probably the next 12 months as well, and say, right, we're going to have to pay that off over 50 years. Because if we don't, although paying it off over 50 years may sound like handing the problem off to your grandchildren, if we don't do that, there won't be a decent-sized economy to support our grandchildren. And my view, I will take a view of the budget, which will be dictated almost entirely by its implications for growth this year. Because the Bank of England said last week, we're going to get back to the same size of economy that we had before COVID. Really? There are going to be quite a large number of companies that are just dead, that are not going to recover. So something's got to take their place. And we're probably talking 5% of the economy. Maybe it's just died. It's necrotic. It's gone. Are we going to suddenly conjure up 5% of the economy in small businesses in 1 year? Not by itself. So I'm afraid I don't approve of the government's intent to increase corporation tax or capital gains tax. Look, we want to encourage business to come here. Yeah? Ironically, the first thing that will bring business here is a non-economic variable. It's the vaccine. It's being ahead of the game. Sure. But the second and third things will be, are we going to be a business-friendly government? And at the moment, the feeling, it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel. So there's going to be pressure for me, and not just me, I'm pretty sure. You're going to get quite a lot of people on the backbenches who are going to be saying, no, we actually have to have, for the time being, lower taxes, not higher taxes, lower in terms of rate, but hopefully not in terms of yield. We really have to force the dynamic tax argument home this time. It's critical now. And don't believe anybody's numbers. Nobody can calculate what will happen in the next year. All we can do is say, this will encourage business, this will encourage employment, this will encourage inward investment, this will encourage savings. That's what we should do. And then we should have to take a very deep breath and look at it again in 18 months, 2 years' time.
Yeah, I don't think you and I are particularly far apart on this. I would happily amortize the COVID debt and sort of let's pay it off over 20, 30, 40 years, take your pick. At some point we've got to tackle the non-COVID part of the ledger as well. We were in any way living beyond our means, and that's been accelerated enormously by this. But would you basically go very dovish? Even if in the short term, right, if you cut taxes, let's even say it would take a number of years for the growth effect to really kick in, you'd accept pretty big budget deficits for the rest of this parliament for the sake of argument, yeah?
For a couple of years at least, anyway, yes, I would. Partly because, the economic impacts of COVID are not just on balancing the books, they've accelerated a whole load of other things which will deny job opportunities to young, this generation going through university. First they've been denied the pleasure of A-levels. I'm not quite sure how they view that, to be honest. but they've been denied all sorts of things. And if at the end of it they come out into an economy that is an arid desert in terms of new jobs, I mean, it won't be an arid desert full stop, but in terms of new jobs, then that's a really serious social inequity, and we've got to think about that. Otherwise, we will end up. I don't want to talk much politics in sort of conventional politics on this, but we will end up with a generation who don't believe in capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
That's not a good outcome either. So yeah, basically whatever we do is a gamble. What you know is you can't do this in a spreadsheet. You can't just say 1% on the tax bill, 1%. It won't be. So you've got to basically take almost a Hayekian view of this and believe in your principles and go with it.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm going to take some of the questions both from Zoom and a few who have been cut and pasted over to me from YouTube. So this could be a bit machine gun fire, David. I'll see what I can do to I'll see what I can do to batch them together. But to go back to the start of our conversation about civil liberties, Gay Hartley asks, I read that there are limitations on every act that takes away our liberties. Is that not true? I don't believe it is true, is it?
No, limitations. No. I mean, even when the government tells you it's true, when there's a sunset clause, when I first arrived in the House, and I didn't, by the way, I didn't view myself as a civil libertarian then. It's Tony Blair that made me a civil libertarian. But when I first arrived in the House, even under Margaret Thatcher, there were special measures for Northern Ireland that had a sunset clause every year. Never once were they reversed whilst we were in trouble. So no, I'm afraid not. There's a ratchet in history, unfortunately, and that ratchet's against us.
Yeah, and what's your sort of solution to that? Is it to try and have, I mean, why don't sunset clauses work? Or is it to try and use parliamentary protocol to gum up the system? Or, this has got to be proactively renewed by Parliament every 6 days rather than not? Is statutory instruments the problem that allows everything through sort of, how do we get the ratchet in our direction?
The whole mechanism of Parliament is against it. I mean, the simple, I mean, I don't want to disparage constitutional theory, but the theory of Crown in Parliament is the government comes along and puts the proposals to the House, and then the House says yes or no. I mean, it can amend it, but it can't come along with let's say, I couldn't turn up in Parliament with a bill saying we are going to cut all these limitations on our freedom and have any chance of getting it even debated, let alone voted through. It's the structure that's there. So our personal liberties are not based on our constitutional structure in Parliament. It's more based on our own intrinsic beliefs, And one of the outcomes of coronavirus may be that you've got a bigger group of people who think, wait a minute, was this a very good idea or not? And will challenge every piece of legislation. But as it stands, there's no easy way to reverse it.
Okay, and again on the liberties piece, this is from an anonymous attendee, so it could be one of your parliamentary colleagues, but this person asks, what does David make of those, these people remain unnamed in the question, what does David make of those purporting to believe in libertarianism or classical liberalism while simultaneously cheerleading the erosion of liberty? Perhaps you could just talk a little about how those on the conservative benches have felt about this. You've mentioned that perhaps there's a few dozen conservative MPs who have now made civil liberties a focus that might not have been so if it had not been for this incident. But what's the sort of feeling within the governing party at the moment? And is there a danger that there are some who are sort of out of one side of their mouth saying, oh yes, I'm all in favour of freedom and everything, but on the other are supporting measures completely to the contrary of that?
Well, look, I mean, the first thing to say is the Conservative Party is not a libertarian party. Let's understand that. It's a coalition of different people. And it, more than most parties, it tends to reflect its electorate. If you come along with a sort of ideology, then maybe you'll turn around and take a Burkean view of your electorate, but we don't have an ideology. We maybe if we either have none or we have a dozen. And so I'm broadly speaking a classical liberal, although not perfectly so, as we just heard when we're talking about the economy. And so you haven't got a big group of those people. When you could pick them out if you wanted to. And look back over look at my competitors for top rebel in the last year. Those are the ones who are your classical liberals, not entirely, but those are they. So my view is, look, they reflect what they think is best for the country. I mean, a lot of the new MPs that have come from so-called red wall seats tend to think that their voters, working class northern voters, take a pretty hard-nosed attitude to civil liberties, and they're not necessarily in favour of it. I actually think that's an oversimplification, but that's their view, and they think they're reflecting their electorates that way. So I can't blame them for that. But I've always, ever since look, when we had the battle with Blair over, actually not 90 days, ID cards, 70% of Tory voters are in favour of ID cards when I started arguing against it. Most of the Parliamentary Party was against ID cards when I started arguing against it. It took a couple of years and some lucky breaks to actually overturn the Blairite approach, but that was circumstance as much as it was me, I'm sorry to say. So you can't make a generalized view. They all, I'm quite sure they all do what they think is best for the country. They're not always right, of course.
So here's another question along those lines, and maybe you can't reach a generalized view on this one. Another of our members of our audience asked, I wonder if David can say why he thinks he's the most rebellious MP. Is he braver than most MPs, more libertarian than conservative, or is it another reason?
Or dafter, maybe, I don't know. When the Times rang me up about this, and I said, well, you are misusing the word rebel. I said, leads rebels, I think it was the headline. I said, you can reasonably say I'm leading a rebellion when, for example, I did lead the rebellion to stop David Cameron bombing Syria without a plan or without decent intelligence, because I sort of corralled about 50 Tories to vote against the government line. That sort of rebellion is important. Mostly, there are a variety of reasons. One, I don't care to. I'm not worried about being on the front bench. I had a conversation with Philip Hammond last week after an interview he did, and he said to me in terms. He said, I hated being a backbencher. I don't. I like being both. I could do things. Indeed, each year when I sit down and review my year, which I do over a glass of whiskey in late July. I call it my $500,000 test on the bland assumption I could have made that much more money outside. And when I'm out of government, I more often pass the test than when I'm in government. So I don't care about that. As partly that. Also, I've been around a long time. And I've got to be fairly distrustful of governments, not distrustful of individual ministers, but the institution. Sometimes can be a bloody nightmare because it just delivers things like a machine, curbing our liberties, and so I'm not afraid to take that on.
Let's move on to a few of the questions which are a bit more about Brexit, Britain's place in the world, regulations, the future of it, and the rest. I think it was Peter Gill over on the YouTube side said, DD mentioned the car industry and regulation. It would be appropriate to ask about what the Climate Change Act is forcing on that industry. You mentioned Sir Humphrey Appleby earlier, David. Do you think there's been a danger prior to us leaving the European Union that we were able to assume that all burdensome regulation came from over there? What's your take on the Climate Change Act? I mean, this is an absolutely colossal economic intervention, in effect, in the economy. I'll make no judgment on whether it's justified or not. I'm not a scientist, but it is certainly burdensome,
Yeah, it's burdensome. And the thing that worries me about the climate change regulation is it seems often to be done as much for symbolic reasons as calculated ones. We were talking earlier about the problem of coronavirus policies where nobody's worked out what the consequence would be. Take the movement to zero petrol engines, basically, 2030 onwards. I mean, the impact of that on the industry, the impact on that on people's existing ownership of petrol engine cars and so on. I mean, let me give you an example. If I've been the Minister in charge, I've been trying to look and see, okay, all right, we want to go down this route, fine, but what's the way we can do it with minimum economic damage or minimum social damage, for that matter? And so, for example, would it be a good idea to have hybrid cars that were electric only for the first 50 or 70 miles? How far do most of us drive in a day? Less than 50 miles. So you could have achieved 90% of the effect for perhaps 5% of the damage, or the cost, more accurately, not damage, the cost. And it seems to me that we don't often enough take a sort of cost-benefit view of these measures, because the argument effectively has been won by one side of the argument, and they're going to push it as hard as they can. Also, the truth of the matter is that people who take an environmentalist argument are very, very passionate about it, and so they do tend to win those simple headline arguments, and don't worry too much about the fine-tuned ones. So, of course, I mean, the idea that all our regulation came from Europe was always a delusion anyway. Always. As I said, Whitehall's a much bigger opponent in that respect than Europe.
So again on Europe, Richard Parsonson asks, no deal with the EU on services. It looks like no equivalence deal for financial services, significant problems for exporters, and of course in Northern Ireland. Does it look like those who argued all along for the EEA EFTA Norway option were right?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I never thought it very likely we'd get much of a deal on services, because we never had much of a deal on. There was never a single market in services. Is the first thing. And the biggest individual sector, financial services, I get completely different views from the city today than what I got 2 years ago. Many of them are now saying, right, we're going to use these opportunities, use our freedoms. This is an area where writing our own regulations will be very important, because we're a leader in the world, not just in Europe on that area. And with the growth of fintech, I think there'll be quite a lot of new opportunities there. Northern Ireland is largely a problem, because I think the misplayed negotiation early on in the Theresa May leadership. I mean, the first point which I thought, God, I'm going to have to resign, was the moment when we conceded full alignment of regulation between North and Southern Ireland, which is in December 2017, and I was basically bypassed by number 10. And she rang me up on a Sunday afternoon and said, we have to agree these words, to which I said, but Prime Minister, that is contradictory to your own speeches. How can you do that? That's where that pass was sold. It didn't need to be sold. Let's give you a little test of that, an empirical test, just not, because, by the way, in Brexit, almost everybody seems to only believe the bits that suit their own half of the argument. And so there's a real problem in believing this. But let me give you one piece of evidence. In the House of Commons and in the Dáil, the heads of revenue and customs in each country were asked way back in 2017, mid 2017, will you be able to handle the border in Northern Ireland without putting a visible border in place? Both of them said yes, unequivocally yes, both in Ireland and in Britain. But the trouble is, it became a political shibboleth, and everybody refused to believe that from there on. It wasn't that it wasn't true, they just refused to believe it. So it's more down to the negotiation, and that'll be, I said before, we're going to be years working out some of the knots in this particular problem, and that'll be the biggest one. That'll be the biggest issue. We'll get there, but it will be a long, slightly wearing process, and I'm afraid, you can't assume the European Union will act in our interest. It won't. It'll act solely in its own political and economic interest, and so we'll have to fight our corner.
So, given you've touched on the Northern Ireland issue, David, and you were brave enough to sort of give us a pen picture of how you think the regulatory environment might change, and that we should look over 10 or 20 years, a very unpredictable time span. Do you think there's a danger that we're going to see a constitutional convulsion within the United Kingdom? We've got this issue with Northern Ireland, and you've given us some of the immediate history around that. The immediate history, obviously, it's got a long history. Scotland, possibility of a second referendum, or at least asking for one. Are we now, having done Brexit, get over COVID, potentially going to have a huge amount of introspection about the constitutional framework and settlement within the UK itself?
The answer to are we going to have the introspection? Yes, I'm sure we are. No two ways about that. Its causes are not. I mean, some say Brexit caused that. Not entirely. Some of it may be. COVID caused a fair amount of it. Just the comparative appearance of the two leaders of Scotland, and in this particular case, England and Wales, or England in the form of Boris, has led to a lot of how can I say, talking up Nicola Sturgeon. And if they get a strong victory in the Holyrood elections just coming, then she will obviously try and deploy that to get another referendum. Now, the fact is that when they took the last referendum through, Alex Salmond, of course, no longer her friend, but Alex Salmond said, this is a once in a generation vote. Well, a generation is more than a few years. Also, I think a snapshot of an opinion poll, what people are talking about with Scotland, is no more indicative now than it was last time around. And the economic consequences for Scotland of leaving the United Kingdom are spectacularly bad. I mean, they are spectacularly bad. I mean, they will start with a financial deficit which will make your eyes water. Carrying the burden of pensions and all the other burdens they don't carry at the moment in their own sort of tax regime. So I think that's less of a risk. It's not zero risk, but less of a risk than people say. With respect to Northern Ireland, the driver there is something different again. Anyway, it's more cultural than it is economic. But we are going to have to move heaven and earth to make the economic engine in Northern Ireland work. So the Irish government, they're going to want it to work too, because the two economies are so heavily integrated. But if we do so, I think that again will settle down. So I'm not as worried as some, but I don't for a moment say it's zero risk in either case.
Looking further afield, although it might touch, I guess, somewhat on the Irish question, one of our guests asked, what are David's thoughts on President Biden, and how will this impact or affect the special relationship? And I'm going to take that conjoined with another question, just to sort of do a bit of globalism entirely across the globe on China. Does David agree that we need to change our approach to relations with China? If so, what foreign policy approach does he favour? So you mentioned China was going to emerge and the US would be primus inter pares in the democratic West, but what's your take on the States at the moment, and how do we need to change our Sino relations in the years to come?
Well, for reasons that aren't necessarily entirely rational, the Western attitude to China is changing of itself. I mean, yesterday or today, the World Health Organization Commission said, we don't think it came out of a laboratory, the coronavirus. Well, who knows in truth? But those sorts of fears, those sorts of concerns, worries about the way China reacted in the first place, a very sort of covert, closed response to what became a global threat, all of those are going to change the mindset with respect to China. So is the exposure of what they've been doing to the Uyghurs, which frankly does look a bit like some unfortunate previous countries' behavior with respect to minorities. So all of that's going to change. Now, this all hangs on how the balance of power works. And before I go on to that, Biden is actually notable. I mean, Biden called Boris first in Europe, all of that. I mean, I think there's been an awful lot of supposedly well-informed comment, which is just guesswork about Biden. What do we know about Biden? Firstly, he's been around a long time, as we know. His interest has been international affairs. Those are the committees he's chaired. So he takes a global interest. That's a good thing. That's a good thing. Now, particularly given this complete change in the balance of power that's going to take place. in the new world, when China's the biggest and it's got military power to go with it, the only way we can make this work is if we work together. You know, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Taiwan, America, ourselves, to some extent the European Union. All of those have to work together to protect each other. Otherwise, you're going to get picked off. What China's doing to Australia at the moment, where it's really putting a lot of economic pressure on it, will happen to everybody when it suits China. So that cooperation becomes a necessity. Yeah, just as NATO post the Second World War became a necessity, and you know that rather dramatic Article 5, where an invasion of one is an invasion of all, we may need an economic equivalent of that, which says the mistreatment of one member of the Western democracies becomes a mistreatment of all of them. Now, that's one other good reason to be pleased about Brexit, because frankly, that was not the attitude taken by the European Union over measures relating to both Russia and China and others. So I think this is an area where Biden and Boris will have to work together. And you know, what's Boris really good at? He's good at the sunlit upland speech and leadership of saying, you know, these are the opportunities, this is where we're going. There are opportunities in this, but there are opportunities which we've got to be rigorous about thinking about, and where we've got to work to what is not always our own immediate interest. And that's oddly easier for us to do than for the Americans. The Americans have always had an American exceptionalism approach to the world. They've got to learn that, you know, their interest is in defending their allies in the economic sphere. And that's where Biden may come up trumps, if that's not a very bad word.
Well, that's fascinating. I appreciate the specifics are going to be hard to grasp here, but do you think there would need to be a new institutional framework for that, some sort of, I don't know, economic NATO or some such like, or do you think it's all done bilaterally between men and women of goodwill?
I would favour an economic NATO. You've seen the sort of beginnings of the genesis of this with the so-called D10 and so on, and I would favour it. You know, and I think many countries would leap at it. I think, you know, the East Asian countries would leap at it to have some sort of backup. You've got to be very careful that you don't. I mean, NATO was hugely successful for reasons which aren't just about NATO. But you know, the same mechanisms can be the mechanisms of interlocking treaties that drag you into wars, right? Never forget that in the Second World, Japanese involvement in the Second World War was at least in part triggered by the fact the Americans tried to sort of surround the so-called economic prosperity sphere and deny things like oil to Japan. So you've got to be careful how you do it, but I would actually favour an economic NATO, or global economic NATO, which is committed to free trade, but committed to making sure that that free trade is fair and the individuals aren't picked off. That would be a very, very, in my view, that would be if Biden had one legacy out of his time, that would be a great one for him to have.
I'm going to finish from our audience on a couple of, I guess you'd say they're sort of libertarian-y type questions, and then I'm going to finish with a question of my own, asking you to reflect on your career in Parliament, David. One of them, this is an area that you've been very live to. David, why is the government refusing to acknowledge the efficacy of vitamin D? You correctly nearly guessed earlier, David, before we went on air, that I was in somewhere sunny. I'm trying to get my vitamin D by being in the sunshine here in Tenerife. I've been here a good few weeks. God knows how I'm going to get back, or how much, whether I have to spend 10 days in the Gatwick Hilton or God knows what by the time the rules have changed. But why is the government refusing to acknowledge the efficacy of vitamin D? What's the story here?
I mean, the first thing you have to understand is that most ministers are not scientists, right? Indeed, I don't know of one that is, to be honest. But most ministers are not scientists. Therefore, they're somewhat in the hands of the scientific advisors they have around them. And I know the views they're getting from the scientific advisors are divided. The immunological aspects of vitamin D were only really discovered in the 80s. That meant they weren't being taught they may not even be taught in medical schools now, but certainly weren't being taught before 2000. As a result, most people are not aware, most medics are not aware of it. Secondly, the industry itself that produces it, the supplements industry, has a history of overclaiming ridiculously, and most supplements, 90% of supplements you buy, well, the best you can say about them is they're harmless. They don't do you any harm. Vitamin D is very different. It's the reason people indigenous to the north have pale skins. You don't need to generate much of it in the equator. You have it all the time, and the truth is that vitamin D deficiency undermines the immune system in the winter, which is why we get so many illnesses in the winter. So I think what's going to happen, I think the government's going to get there. Matt Hancock's announced the 3rd review of vitamin D only the other day, and that, unlike the other 2, that wasn't at my behest. I didn't press him. So I think what's happening is the evidence is building and building, and we'll get there. The good thing about it is I think we'll get there by the summer. Won't stop this problem, but it may help us with the next pandemic and next winter's version of COVID.
Here's a downbeat last question from our audience before I finish with one of my own. Martin Hewlett, David, he asks, we're at the point where a Conservative government passes legislation to tackle the horrific dangers, he puts in quotes, of Coca-Cola, Frosties and bacon. It seems clear over the past 20 years that precaution and safety have become more important than liberty. How has this happened? When will politicians wake up and reverse this trend?
Well, the politics is always about the fight between caution on the one hand and liberty on the other. Most of us believe that we have the right to make our own decisions about our own safety. Clearly, there's a trade-off in that, and also risk levels, acceptable risk levels, have gone down. Mark mentioned my Territorial Army involvement. In those days, the risk was of obliteration in nuclear war, or being dominated by the Soviet bloc. My predecessors in Parliament, my 2 predecessors in the 2 seats that make up my current one, were the last 2 double-decorated officers from the Second World War in the House of Commons. They had an MC and a DSO. Their idea of risk, they would sort of look at us slightly askance today, I think. Today, acceptable risk is much, much lower. That's part of it. The second thing is just simply mistakes. You talk about food. The simple truth is that the government advice, I think there's a very strong, arguable scientific case. The government advice on diet for the last 50 years has made our diets worse, not better. And actually, if you gave me the option of having a royal commission on something, I think I'd probably have a royal commission on public health, because Public Health England has not done a great job, bluntly, in this pandemic, with all the failures on testing and so on. But it didn't do a great job before then in terms of actually on dietary advice and all the rest of it. So the reason we've got there is a completely different public perception of risk on the one hand, and politicians reflecting that. How do we solve it? We solve it by being a little more scientific and rational about before we give away our freedoms without thinking about it.
Let me finish, David, by asking you to sort of look back on your, what is it now, near 34 years in Parliament. You mentioned that each July you do a sort of annual audit of yourself, have a glass of whiskey or something and reflect on how much more you could have earned in the private sector. But I was going to ask you, when have you felt most optimistic and most pessimistic about the future of Britain over the course of your 30 plus years in Parliament? And where are you on that spectrum now? Dead in the middle, or perhaps it is the most pessimistic or the most optimistic time since you entered Parliament in 1987?
Yeah, I mean, look, first thing to say, I'll talk about the most pessimistic in a second, but the first thing to say is there are huge causes for optimism, despite the fact I might complain to myself about not earning a lot of money outside. I am, in real terms, we all are, in real terms, wealthier than our predecessors. And they're wealthier than their predecessors because capitalism and the liberal capitalist democracies have been a fantastic success story. I mean, one of the reasons, by the way, that Brexit was a worthwhile exercise is because after the Uruguay round back in 1992, the whole world had more free trade as tariffs came down. What was the result of that? 1.5 billion people lifted out of absolute poverty. 1.5 billion, for heaven's sake. The world is living longer. healthier, better, more enjoyable, more satisfied lives than they ever have in history. So, capitalism is good for you. It ought to be a sort of motto.
That's what Public Health England should be campaigning on then, basically.
I wish you well with that battle. I'm not sure you'll ever win it. But so in optimism terms, the truth is, so long as we don't mess it up ourselves, as long as we are every year gets better. So let's not fuss about that. I mean, one of the reasons I have the luxury to fight about civil liberties is because I don't have to worry about kids going down the pit, or kids dying of rickets or whatever it is. I mean, now obviously there's poverty, but you've got a balance of a balance here. The most downbeat day of my life in politics was the night before Margaret Thatcher resigned, when basically she was pulled down by other politicians, and at the time I thought it was a terrible day, right? This lady had transformed not just Britain, she had transformed the world, by force of character, intellect, all the rest of it. Now, and using a model which we broadly would agree with, a pro-capitalist, pro-responsible finance, intelligent role in the world for Britain and so on. And yet, we carried on and the world continued getting better, even though one of my great heroines had gone. So my day of pessimism gave way to a decade of optimism. So I think, the truth is we are very lucky to live today, on almost every front. And so, my little, it's normally a couple of hours sitting with a pad of A4 and my glass of whiskey, more than one glass of whiskey, I'm sorry to tell you, but there we are. It's normally always an optimistic outcome. It's, we've done something better, we've improved something, we've fought the fight and delivered something that's worth delivering. And of course, in all of that, I lose battles weekly. Let's be clear about this. There is no end to this down escalator that I'm running up. I lose battles every week, but we all win them as well. And you look round, and on balance, the outcome's been pretty bloody good. So I'm pretty happy with it.
David, what an upbeat, optimistic note on which to end this in conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating hour covering a vast range of topics. I hope it's not too long before we can meet in person again soon, but it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you, David. Thank you so much for this IEA webinar. Real pleasure to have you and your thoughts. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you who have joined us, both on the Zoom side and the many viewers on the YouTube side as well. Sorry, I couldn't get through all of your questions. I can see there's a dozen or more that I haven't been able to put. My apologies for that. But all the more reason to join us for some of our upcoming online events. We have more in convos coming up. I'll be in conversation with Dan Hannan, now Lord Hannan, on Tuesday, the 23rd of February at 6 p.m. with Kwasi Kwarteng, the business secretary, on March the 2nd at 6 p.m. and with Charles Moore, Margaret Thatcher's biographer, on 9th of March at 6 p.m. My regular show live with Littlewood to consider the week's events and what free market liberals should make of them. That's back not tomorrow, but next Wednesday at 6 p.m. Please join us then. And also a reminder to check out our new series on economic history on YouTube with our head of education, Dr. Steve Davies. That's a supplementary series to our recent series, Econ 101. And my thanks again to the Monterey Trust for their assistance in making that happen. Thanks all for joining us. Thanks especially to our donors. You make our work possible. But overwhelmingly, my thanks to David for an hour of his time. Have a great evening. Over and out.